On a quiet night in 1998, 5 people walked out of their homes, and the world never saw them again. What links these vanishings spread across towns, when no evidence connects a single soul? Tonight, we uncover the strange objects, the overlooked witnesses, and the secrets that refuse to stay buried. Welcome to Silent Case. Let's start the case. Between 9:12 and 12:07 p.m., 5 people from 5 different towns stepped into night air and vanished as if the darkness itself swallowed them whole. Decades later, investigators would call it the 3-hour window. But on that storm-heavy night in 1998, nothing about the disappearances felt connected. Not yet. The first report came from the quiet outskirts of Ridgebury, where 31-year-old Michael Harrow left his porch light on, keys in the door, and dinner half-plated on the counter. Outside, a pickup truck idled with its headlights off. No one ever confirmed if Michael approached it, or if someone came to the door. His neighbor, awakened by thunder, later told police he heard a car door slam twice. At 9:58, 15 miles south in Claveston, Marla Reeves, a local art teacher, placed a phone call to her sister. She spoke only 3 words before the line went dead. "Hold on, someone." The receiver was discovered later, dangling from the table edge, rhythmic static pulsing through it like a heartbeat. Investigators initially suspected a home invasion, but there was no sign of struggle. Her umbrella lay open in the hallway, water pooling beneath it, as though she stepped inside only moments before disappearing again. By 10:43, the storm had intensified. Sheets of rain buried Hollister Creek, where 9-year-old Drew Callan was last seen in his bedroom. His mother said he was drawing before bed. A picture of a moonlit field, a stick figure standing beneath a bright, floating shape. The drawing was later found torn in half, one piece taped to the underside of his desk. The other half lay folded in his shoe. No footprints, no forced entry, no open window, just absence. An hour later, in Laneford, 24-year-old Rhea Sal, a nursing student on her way home from an evening shift, parked her car beside her apartment building. She gathered her things, locked the door, and walked toward the stairwell. But she never made it inside. Her car sat untouched until morning, driver's seat adjusted perfectly to her height, bag neatly placed on the passenger side. The storm washed away any trace of where she might have gone. The 5th disappearance came from Hazelmoor, a town so small most residents didn't lock their doors. At 12:07, 62-year-old Tom Whitmer, a retired electrician, stepped outside after telling his wife he heard something buzzing near the fence. She waited for him to return. He never did. The rain eased shortly after, leaving only the low hum of telephone wires and the empty space where he had stood. 5 vanishings. 5 ordinary nights turned inside out. The storm, intense but unremarkable, served as a perfect veil, blurring timelines, flooding prints, and muting sounds that might have carried answers. By dawn, each town filed its missing person report separately. No agency thought to connect them. Wrong places, wrong times, wrong details. It seemed impossible that threads stretched between these lives. But they did. Late that morning, while cataloging items from Michael Harrow's porch, a rookie officer pulled a small metal object from the steps. A keychain engraved with initials. Not his initials. Not his family's. Not anyone's from Ridgebury. A piece of someone else's life, left at the scene of his disappearance. And it would take years before anyone realized it belonged to victim number 3. Morning arrived like a slow bruise stretching across the sky, purple, heavy, and uneasy. By the time sunlight finally touched the towns where the 5 disappearances occurred, the sense that something was deeply wrong had already spread from household whispers to frantic phone calls. No one yet knew of the others who had vanished, but the silence left behind by each missing person carried the same shape, the same cold outline of an absence that couldn't be explained away. In Brookfield, officers began their search for Thomas Reddick, the man whose truck was found idling outside his home all night. The vehicle was still warm when police arrived at dawn, as if someone had sat in it long after he disappeared. Inside, the keys were in the ignition, the driver's seat pulled back slightly, as if a taller person had been behind the wheel. But there were no signs of struggle, no footprints leading into the woods, no tire marks showing a second car. It was as though Thomas had met someone he trusted enough to step outside and never step back in. Meanwhile, 50 miles away, 12-year-old Mia Lauren's mother was on her knees in the living room, clutching the torn half of her daughter's drawing. Search teams fanned out across the neighborhood, calling Mia's name again and again. Dogs circled the area, catching brief scents that disappeared as quickly as they formed. The last person to see her had been a neighbor walking her dog at 10:03 p.m. She reported a shadow near the street lamp, a tall figure standing unnaturally still. She assumed it was Mia's older brother waiting for a ride. But Mia's brother wasn't home that night, and he wasn't tall. In Glenford, police questioned the last person who spoke to Angela Pierce before her phone went dead. Her friend described hearing a soft click mid-sentence, as if someone else had quietly lifted another receiver on the same line. When technicians later inspected the house, they found the phone off the hook, but placed gently on the floor, not dropped. Angela's slippers were by the kitchen doorway, positioned neatly, toes pointed outward. Every investigator had the same reaction. She didn't leave in a hurry. As morning turned to afternoon, each case was treated individually. Separate files, separate teams, separate theories. But a pattern was beginning to show. Each disappearance happened within a 3-hour window. Each victim had been alone. And each scene contained an object that felt wrong, as if a stranger had moved through their lives without understanding how ordinary people live. Detectives didn't see the connection yet, but families did. They gathered at their local police stations, asking the same questions with the same fear in their voices. Did anyone else go missing last night? Officials dismissed it at first, chalking up to panic. It wasn't until a dispatcher noticed overlapping timestamps on the incident reports that someone finally paused. By evening, word reached the regional headquarters. 5 disappearances, 5 towns, 1 night, and one more detail emerged, quiet, almost overlooked, until an officer realized it changed everything. From Thomas Reddick's driveway, investigators recovered a muddy boot print, but the print didn't match Thomas. And it didn't match anyone in the search team. It matched a 6th person, someone no one had reported missing yet. By the 4th day, the frenzy of the searches had begun to dull into something heavier, something quieter and more suffocating than panic. The forest trails had been combed, the riverbanks checked twice, and dogs brought in from neighboring counties had circled the same perimeters until their paws bled. The boot print found near Thomas Reddick's driveway had been photographed, cast, and compared against every known work boot in the regional database. No match, not even a close one. Detectives had hoped the print would spark momentum, but instead it became another hanging thread. Taunting, incomplete, refusing to lead anywhere. And yet, it was the only thing that connected the 5 cases to something or someone. Inside the Glenford Regional Headquarters, investigators gathered in the smallest conference room, the one used for cases that didn't need larger teams or longer discussions. But today, every chair was occupied. Case files were spread across the table. Thomas's truck photos, Mia's torn drawing, Angela's discarded phone receiver, and the reports of the 2 others whose disappearances were equally abrupt, equally silent. For the first time, the cases were no longer treated as isolated events. A single word had been written on the whiteboard in thick black marker. Linked. But linking them did not bring clarity. It brought confusion. Detective Rowan, who had been assigned to Angela Pierce's case, pointed to the board where the times were listed in a narrow column. 5 disappearances in just under 3 hours, he said. 5 different locations. If this was one person, they had to move fast. Too fast. Another officer countered. Unless they weren't moving at all. The room fell silent at that, because buried inside each report was the same unsettling truth. None of the scenes showed signs of forced entry. None showed a chase or struggle. None suggested fear. Every victim had left their surroundings quietly, almost willingly, as if guided by something familiar or commanded by something they couldn't refuse. Files were closed, reopened, and closed again. Witness statements contradicted each other. A neighbor claimed she saw a tall figure by the street lamp, but another said the street lamp flickered all night and shadows danced strangely on the asphalt. A truck driver swore He saw a second vehicle near Thomas's driveway around midnight, but camera footage from the only traffic light on the road showed nothing. Either the driver was mistaken, or the vehicle never passed a camera at all. As the first week slipped into the second, the pressure to find answers turned into an ache no one spoke about openly. The families visited the station daily, asking if there was any news. Officers gave the same rehearsed replies. Reporters camped outside the building, hungry for details. The public whispered theories: kidnapping ring, cult activity, serial offender, none of which fit the timeline cleanly. Eventually, the search teams thinned out. Officers were reassigned. Budgets tightened. And the case files moved from the active investigation shelf to the gray metal drawer labeled cold. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but no longer warm enough to chase. Yet something strange lingered around the cases, an unease that refused to settle. Patrol officers reported seeing unfamiliar tire tracks outside rural homes at night. A farmer found a child's bracelet in a field miles from where Mia vanished. A hunter swore he heard someone calling for help deep in the pines, only for the voice to stop abruptly when he approached. None of these details were large enough to reopen the files, but they were too odd to ignore. And then, just when the cases seemed destined to freeze forever, a new envelope arrived at the station. No return address, no postage stamp, just a single item inside: a photograph, taken in a place no one recognized. And in the corner of the frame stood someone who should have been missing. 22 years had passed since the stormy night in 1998 when 5 people vanished within 3 hours. The files had long since grown yellowed at the edges. The photos curled in their sleeves. The type reports faded into a muted gray. What had once been urgent, the frantic calls, the canvassing of streets, the desperate prayers of families, had settled into quiet resignation. The cases were cold, forgotten by most, but not by those who remembered every missing smile, every unanswered phone call, every empty room. Detective Rowan, now retired but still carrying the weight of those early investigations, kept a personal journal of unsolved cases. He had never stopped thinking about Thomas, Mia, Angela, and the others. 22 years later, the ache of not knowing had not softened. It had crystallized. He would often sit at his desk at dawn, tracing timelines and cross-referencing old evidence, fingers hovering over photographs as if touching them could bring the vanished back. In a dusty storage room of the Ridgebury Police Department, a junior officer unearthed a small cardboard box labeled 1998, open if needed. Inside were letters, torn sketches, and the infamous metal keychain that did not belong to Michael Harrow. It had sat unnoticed for years, cataloged incorrectly, lost in the shuffle of paperwork. When Rowan was shown the object, he paused. The initials engraved in the metal were faint but legible, belonging to someone who had never been reported missing that night. For the families, the past 2 decades had been a slow erosion of hope. Mia's mother had moved away from the neighborhood, the empty room in her home preserved as a shrine to a daughter whose laughter was now a ghost. Angela's father, now older and quieter, still walked past her favorite cafe each morning, half expecting to see her sitting at the corner table, smiling, as if she had only stepped out for a moment. Thomas's widow kept the truck in the garage, polished and ready, as if he might return at any time. The passage of time had hardened grief into ritual, sorrow into silent memory. Then, a call arrived from an unlisted number. The voice on the other end was hesitant, careful. It spoke of something found in the outskirts of Ridgebury, a photograph, partially buried beneath leaves in a forest clearing. The image was grainy, aged by years, yet unmistakable. The 5 missing people, standing together, smiling, as if they had never disappeared at all. Their clothes, hairstyles, even the storm outside, were out of time, out of place. The photograph reignited questions that had lain dormant for decades. Who had taken the photo? Why had it surfaced now? And, most importantly, what had really happened that night? Investigators began to sift through old evidence with fresh eyes, muddy boot prints re-examined, forgotten fingerprints run through new databases, and every witness statement compared with satellite imagery and weather reports from the day in question. As the years had passed, technology had caught up with memory. What was once invisible could now be traced. And as detectives prepared to reopen the cold cases officially, one truth was undeniable. Someone, had been orchestrating the disappearances, leaving behind a trail too subtle for the authorities to notice in 1998. And now, with 22 years of shadows lifting, the first tangible clue of their fate had finally emerged. A photograph, a message, a promise that the silence was about to end. Because the next discovery would reveal a secret that no one could have anticipated, and it would force the world to look again at what truly happened that night. When the photograph arrived, it was accompanied by a small, nondescript package. Inside lay a single object, a weathered brass locket, its chain tangled and darkened by years of neglect. The object had no return address, no note, no explanation. It had survived storms, dust, and decades of oblivion. Yet there it was, small and insistent, demanding attention from anyone willing to see it for what it truly represented, a fragment of a life that should have vanished entirely. Detective Rowan held the locket in his palm, turning it over slowly, tracing the scratches etched across its surface. The initials inside, faint but precise, belonged to Mia Lorne, the child whose torn drawing had once been the only clue to her sudden disappearance. How it had ended up here, decades later, was impossible to explain. The weight of it was more than physical. It carried the gravity of a mystery that had refused to release its grip on everyone involved. Laboratory tests revealed something even stranger. The locket contained traces of soil not found near any of the 5 original disappearance sites. It was layered with mud from a region more than 100 miles away, a place no one had ever considered when the original searches had taken place. Fingerprints were partially preserved, though decades of wear had rendered them incomplete. Still, one ridge pattern stood out, a match not to any of the missing, not to any known relative, not to anyone in the police database. Across the region, families were notified, and the locket became a focal point of renewed hope and anxiety. Thomas Reddick's widow stared at it, tracing her husband's initials on the photograph that accompanied the object, whispering his name as though calling him through time. Angela Pierce's father held a small brass circle against his chest, his knuckles white, a sudden ache that was both familiar and unbearable. The object was small, yet carried the weight of every unanswered question, every sleepless night, every decade of uncertainty. The investigative team realized that the locket was not merely a clue. It was a message. Whoever had left it knew the importance of attention to detail, understood the connections among the 5 victims, and had waited until the moment was right to intervene. The photograph and locket were linked, both surfacing simultaneously after 22 years of silence. New forensic techniques were employed. Soil analysis suggested the locket had been buried, briefly, in a floodplain before being uncovered. Its journey could be traced, partially, through river deposits and plant remnants, giving the investigators a rough trajectory, a path that had crossed multiple towns in ways that might explain why the disappearances had seemed unconnected. And yet, the locket also raised an unnerving question. It had belonged to Mia. How did it end up so far from her last known location, and why had it been preserved with such care? The answer lay just beyond reach, like the edge of a photograph blurred by rain. It hinted at planning, perhaps obsession, and a level of foresight that chilled every officer who examined it. As the team carefully documented the object, a quiet realization settled over them. The locket was only the beginning. It was a breadcrumb leading down a path darker and stranger than anything anyone had imagined in 1998. And somewhere along that path, the truth of the disappearances, why 5 lives had vanished in 3 hours, was waiting to be uncovered. Because now, with a single impossible object in their hands, the investigators had the first tangible connection to a secret that had slept for more than 2 decades. The next discovery, they feared and hoped, would shatter everything they thought they knew. The locket had reignited the investigation, and the first step was to revisit the people who had once been closest to cases. Detectives began scheduling interviews, not just with the families, but with former neighbors, co-workers, and anyone who had even a fleeting connection to the 5 missing individuals. Each conversation was a careful dance, balancing empathy with the need for detail, and often uncovering memories long buried, some mundane, some chilling. Mia Lorne's old teacher, for example, recalled the day she had asked Mia to stay after class for extra help. She seemed distracted, the teacher said, eyes distant, as if she were listening for something no one else could hear. At the time, the remark had seemed trivial, a quirk of a sensitive child. Now, it took on a sinister significance. Every statement, every recollection was filtered through 22 years of absence, and yet patterns began to emerge. Glimpses of strangers near homes, odd phone calls that went unanswered, shadows at windows. Details previously dismissed as coincidence now appeared as threads in a carefully woven tapestry. But the deeper the investigators delved, the more they encountered redactions. Old files were released by local agencies, but entire paragraphs were blacked out. One report mentioned a witness who claimed to see a figure near Thomas Reddick's driveway the night he vanished. In the margin, someone had scrawled, "Do not disclose, case pending." Why, after 22 years, was something still pending? Who had maintained the secrecy, and to what end? Attempts to speak with the sheriff at the time were met with stone silence. Retired now, he offered little beyond a vague assurance that everything possible had been done. Yet his presence lingered like a shadow over the investigation, the unexplained reticence feeding speculation. Why had no comprehensive follow-up been conducted when initial leads emerged? Why had certain pieces of evidence, like the mismatched locket or the strange tire tracks, been left unexamined for decades? Former investigators, too, had their stories. One officer described how a senior detective had warned him to avoid certain details in official reports, underlining the importance of discretion. "It didn't feel right," he admitted, "but you follow orders and you put trust in the system. We all thought it was over when the files went cold. We thought it was the end." Now, with the photograph and locket resurfacing, that trust was fragile, fraying under the weight of new questions. Each interview added texture to a picture that was still incomplete. Witnesses who had once seemed unreliable now revealed consistent details. A man in a black jacket who appeared near more than one scene, a blue van that no one could place, a flickering light in the distance at precisely the times of the disappearances. The investigation, however, was still limited by what had been kept hidden. Redactions obscured the full story, and the silent sheriff remained an enigmatic figure, his past decisions casting long shadows over the present. And yet, amidst the frustration, a sense of momentum began to build. The pieces, though scattered, were beginning to form a pattern, a map of connections invisible to those who had seen only fragments. Because just as interviews and redactions revealed what had been buried, the next discovery promised to expose a truth so unsettling that it would force the investigators and the families into a confrontation with the reality of what had happened on that storm-heavy night 22 years ago. The photograph, the locket, and now the whispered recollections were converging. And what emerged next would pull the case in the shadows into a harsh, unforgiving light. As the investigation deepened, one name kept surfacing quietly, almost too casually, in witness statements and old reports, a man who had always been on the periphery, observed but never interrogated, noted but never considered a suspect. His presence had been dismissed as inconsequential at the time, a neighbor, a delivery driver, a passerby. Yet now, 22 years later, those same observations were viewed through a lens sharpened by hindsight and the strange new evidence. Detective Rowan reviewed the old files again, scrutinizing the man's movements, photographs, and interactions. He appeared in multiple locations across different towns on the day of the disappearances, always just out of reach of investigators. Surveillance footage from local businesses placed him near Thomas Reddick's driveway, outside Mia Loren's school, and near Angela Pierce's favorite cafe. None of it had raised alarm in 1998. The towns were small, and his comings and goings seemed ordinary. But patterns now emerging revealed a coordinated presence that no one had noticed at the time. Family members, initially reluctant to revisit the past, now described him in vivid detail. Thomas's widow remembered seeing him on the street when she had walked her dog that morning. He had smiled, waved, then disappeared down an alley. Angela's father recalled a similar encounter near the cafe, a fleeting glance that unsettled him, though he had never shared before. Even Mia's teacher had a recollection of the man outside the classroom, lingering in the corner of her vision, a figure she had assumed was part of the cityscape. The more the team uncovered, the stranger the pattern became. Phone records placed him in proximity to all 5 missing individuals within that narrow 3-hour window, yet he had no apparent connection to any of them. Background checks revealed he had changed addresses frequently, left employment records incomplete, and held no criminal history. Officially, he was a ghost, perceived but invisible, present yet untouchable. When detectives approached him for questioning, the man's demeanor was calm, almost unsettlingly so. He spoke politely, offered vague explanations, and insisted he had no knowledge of the disappearances. But subtle contradictions in his statements began to surface. An inconsistency in the timing of his route, a discrepancy in the vehicles he claimed to have driven, and a hesitancy that betrayed awareness of more than he revealed. The investigative team realized that this was the first person who could potentially connect all 5 cases. If his movements, intentionally or coincidentally, had intersected with each victim, then the long-held assumption of randomness was shattered. He was, perhaps, the single thread linking what seemed like 5 isolated tragedies. As Rowan reviewed the compiled evidence, a shiver ran down his spine. The man had been overlooked for decades, shadowed by mundane explanations and bureaucratic oversight. And yet, in that oversight lay the key to unraveling the stormy night of 1998. The clock was ticking, and the detective knew that confronting him would likely open a Pandora's box of truths long buried. One question loomed larger than any. What had he done that night? And why had he left no trace of himself, until now? Because the next discovery they feared would force the investigation into uncharted territory, where motives would be revealed, alibis shattered, and the 5 missing would finally come into focus, at least for the first time in 22 years. The investigation had taken the detectives into offices, backyards, and long-forgotten alleys, but the breakthrough came unexpectedly beneath the towns themselves. An abandoned network of storm drains and old service tunnels, built decades earlier and largely forgotten, revealed itself as a hidden stage for the night of the disappearances. The tunnels were narrow, damp, and lined with graffiti and peeling paint, a shadowed labyrinth that whispered of secrets no one had wanted to confront. Detective Rowan walked slowly along the slick concrete floor, flashlight cutting through darkness, noting every detail. Water dripped from corroded pipes above, and the air smelled of mold and decay, yet it carried a faint scent of something else, an unfamiliar metallic tang that hinted at human presence. As he descended deeper, small fragments of clothing appeared. A child's sock, a faded scarf, a button from a jacket. Each item was cataloged meticulously, each one tied back to one of the 5 missing, a quiet confirmation that this underground network had not been entirely abandoned by fate. Maps revealed that the tunnels ran beneath multiple towns, connecting streets, schools, and neighborhoods in a way no one had realized before. It explained the seemingly impossible timing of the disappearances. The 3-hour window that had baffled investigators now made a cruel kind of sense. Paths underground allowed someone to move from location to location unnoticed, leaving no footprints, no witnesses, just a string of vanished lives. The discovery also aligned eerily with witness reports from years prior. People had spoken of glimpses of figures slipping into alleyways, of lights in places that should have been empty, of sounds that seemed distant but familiar. No one had known to connect those fragments, and the tunnels had remained a secret beneath the surface, waiting for someone to notice. Forensic teams found other traces. Scuffed walls, faint blood smears, a scrap of paper with an indecipherable note, and a series of impressions in the dust that hinted at hurried movement. Each clue confirmed the theory forming in Rowan's mind. Someone had used the tunnels deliberately, exploiting a hidden geography to control the fate of 5 unsuspecting people. Families were called to view some of the recovered items. Angela Pierce's mother ran trembling fingers over a worn shoelace, a wave of grief crashing over her in a way she had not felt in decades. Thomas Reddick's brother, staring at a faded photograph found wedged in a corner, whispered his disbelief aloud. These objects, buried and preserved beneath the towns, were more than evidence. They were echoes of lives interrupted, whispers of fear and control that had been silent for 22 years. And yet, even with these discoveries, the tunnels raised more questions than they answered. Who had orchestrated this labyrinthine nightmare? Why had they chosen this method, this geography, to evade detection for so long? How had the locket surfaced above ground after all these years if the tunnels were meant to conceal everything? As Rowan examined a crumbling stairwell leading up to the street level, he realized the tunnels were not merely a hiding place. They were a message. Whoever had used them had intimate knowledge of the towns, of the people, of the routes that would guarantee both disappearance and mystery. And somewhere just beyond the edges of light and sound, the next piece of the puzzle waited. A lead that would force the investigation above ground once again, pulling the detective and the families closer to a truth they had been denied for more than 2 decades. The tunnels beneath the towns were no longer empty. They were the silent witnesses to a story about to be told. The tunnels beneath the towns had revealed physical traces, but the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Old recordings found in a dusty archive, static-laced and forgotten. Investigators discovered a series of phone calls intercepted years earlier, buried in digital storage, dismissed at the time as background noise. Now, with modern audio enhancement, voices emerged from the static. Fragmented conversations that hinted at the orchestrated nature of the disappearances. Each clip was brief, distorted, almost imperceptible. One snippet revealed a name whispered urgently, Angela, no mistakes. Another contained the sound of hurried footsteps over a metallic surface, followed by a low, commanding voice instructing someone to move them before dawn. There were numbers, addresses, and coded references, all interwoven with the hiss of interference. The team listened repeatedly, transcribing every word, searching for patterns. Every detail, no matter how small, became a thread in a web that had remained invisible for decades. Detective Rowan began connecting the voices to locations above ground. One call coincided with the exact time Thomas Reddick was last seen. Another matched the window when Mia Lorne vanished from her school. The correspondence was chilling in its precision. Whoever had orchestrated the events of that storm-heavy night had monitored timing, movement, and opportunity with meticulous care. It was a methodical choreography of disappearance, designed to leave no trace. Families were brought in to listen under supervision. Angela's father shook as he heard a fragment that mentioned her favorite cafe. He pressed his hand over his mouth, unable to speak. Thomas's brother quietly wept at the mention of a driveway he had long avoided thinking about. The recordings carried not only evidence but the weight of memories, echoing grief 22 years in the making. Yet the voices also revealed anomalies, details that didn't fit the narrative of a single perpetrator. Some instructions seemed contradictory, as if more than one person had been involved. Other snippets suggested hesitation or doubt, faint traces of someone questioning the plan in real time. Rowan realized that the static contained not just evidence of the disappearances, but a glimpse into the psychology of those responsible. Meticulous, ruthless, but also fallible. Cross-referencing the calls with the man previously overlooked, investigators noted overlaps. His whereabouts and the timing of the voices aligned unervingly. The static spoke indirectly of a network, a collaboration, a series of decisions made in whispers and shadows. It was as if the recordings themselves were taunting the living, leaving just enough to be understood, but never entirely clear. And in the background, beneath the faint hum of interference, the sound of another unidentified voice emerged. It was neither commanding nor hesitant. It was almost a whisper, a name repeated softly, insistently, one of the missing. The faint intonation lingered in the mind long after the recording ended, a spectral echo suggesting that, even after 22 years, the story had not yet run its course. The static had become a map of voices, a trail leading closer to the orchestrator, and perhaps closer to truth. Yet it also reminded Rowan that some answers would demand confrontation, a reckoning with those who had remained silent all these years. Because the next chapter promised that confrontation, when evidence and confession would collide, and the mysteries buried in shadow would finally be illuminated. After months of painstaking review, the investigation reached a moment both anticipated and dreaded. The discovery of the final tape. It had been hidden in a rusted, locked filing cabinet. Tucked behind years of archival dust in a county storage room no one had accessed in decades. Unlike the static-laced recordings found earlier, this tape was clearer, intentional, almost theatrical in its delivery. Whoever had made it had known someone would one day find it, had intended the story to be heard, even if only by the living. Detective Rowan held the reel carefully, noting the label scrawled in uneven handwriting. Everything you missed. The word seemed to mock the investigators, a taunt echoing across 22 years. He inserted the tape into the player, and the first moments revealed a voice he had hoped never to hear. It was a man who had been overlooked, the figure who had hovered at the periphery of all 5 cases. His tone was calm, disturbingly measured, recounting the events of that storm-heavy night with unnerving clarity. He described, in chilling detail, how each person had been guided, manipulated, or coerced into leaving their homes. He spoke of tunnels beneath the towns, of deliberate misdirection, and of the precise timing that had made the disappearances appear unrelated. Every word was laced with control, with power, also with regret, as though he had long carried the burden of the lives he had affected. Rowan realized the tape was less a confession than a testimony, an intimate, unflinching look at a mind that had orchestrated terror while remaining unseen. Interspersed with the voice were pauses, almost imperceptible, filled with faint background noises. The scrape of shoes on concrete, the murmur of voices too quiet to distinguish, the subtle click of doors locking. These sounds tied the narration to the physical world, confirming the paths the victims had unknowingly taken and linking them irrevocably to the tunnels discovered beneath the towns. The evidence aligned, almost perfectly, with what had been found above ground. The scattered objects, the anomalies in witness statements, the subtle traces that had haunted the investigation for decades. Yet the tape also revealed contradictions, moments where the narrator's memory faltered or shifted, leaving gaps and raising new questions. Were there accomplices? Were some victims chosen for reasons still unknown? The confessions on the tape answered many questions, but they also deepened the mystery, exposing the limitations of memory and the shadows in which truth can hide. Rowan felt the weight of the family's grief pressing in, decades of unanswered questions now colliding with revelations too complex to process immediately. This tape, however, offered something far more potent than answers. It offered a path forward, a tangible thread connecting the 5 vanishings in a way that could finally lead to justice, recognition, and, perhaps, closure. As the tape ended, the final words lingered in the room, a quiet acknowledgement of guilt, a warning, and an unsettling hint that not all had been revealed. The detective knew the next step would be the most critical, confronting the man, piecing together the remaining fragment of his story, and finally facing the truth that had remained hidden for more than 20 years. Because what awaited in the confrontation promised to either unravel the mystery completely or leave the echoes of those vanished forever suspended between past and present. The confrontation was quiet, almost anticlimactic at first, yet every word carried the weight of decades. Detective Rowan and his team faced a man from the tape in a small, sterile interrogation room, the hum of fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across his face. He sat calmly, hands folded, eyes steady, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. The tape had been the key, but it was the questions, the relentless pursuit, that finally forced the details into the open. He spoke of motivations that seemed almost banal against the enormity of his actions. Control, attention, the thrill of orchestrating events from the shadows. He admitted to planning the disappearances meticulously, using the town's forgotten tunnels and timing to create confusion, to mask patterns that no one could yet see. The storm-heavy night of 1998 had been carefully chosen, not random. 5 people, taken within 3 hours, each selected with precise criteria, though he remained evasive about why these particular individuals. Rowan pressed on, carefully unpacking each fragment of the puzzle. The man admitted to placing objects at the scenes to mislead investigators, items that didn't belong to the missing, artifacts meant to distract, to create dead ends. He described moving through streets, tunnels, and alleyways with surgical precision, leaving no trace that could be tied directly to him. It was methodical, chilling, and yet, strangely, it revealed cracks in his confidence. The careful facade faltered when he spoke of moments he had not anticipated. The unexpected curiosity of a neighbor, the inadvertent discovery of a clue by a young investigator, the persistence of families who refused to let go. The detective realized that, even now, the man could not fully contain the truth. Time had eroded his control, leaving fragments exposed. He confessed to underestimating the emotional endurance of those left behind, the families who kept searching, questioning, and refusing to accept disappearance as final. In doing so, he revealed more than just his actions. He exposed the profound human cost of his obsession, the decades of uncertainty, grief, and haunting what is endured by those who had loved the vanished. Yet, even in confession, the man held secrets. There were omissions, fleeting references to accomplices he never fully named, hints at decisions and movements that still eluded investigators. Rowan understood that while some truths had surfaced, others remained buried, entangled with memory, manipulation, and the sheer passage of time. The detective's challenge was now to separate fact from deception, to identify the fragments that could finally bring closure, and to recognize those that might remain forever in shadow. The families listened from another room, hearts alternating between relief and anguish. Some tears were for validation, some for years lost, some for questions that would never be answered. The truth had been partially revealed, but its impact was complete. It reshaped their understanding of the events, of the people involved, and of the terrifying precision with which their loved ones had been taken. And as the man was escorted away for further proceedings, Rowan knew that the final chapter of the story, the ultimate reckoning, the unveiling of all that had been hidden, was imminent. Justice, truth, and memory would converge, leaving nothing untouched, as the echoes of the vanished prepared to resurface in full. The investigation, after 22 years, was finally closing in on a resolution that could honor the missing and confront the darkness that had waited so long in the shadows. Even as the man was taken into custody, the true weight of the case settled over the towns like a heavy fog. Evidence had been uncovered, confessions recorded, timelines reconstructed, but the 5 missing were still absent. Their faces haunted the community, their absence a constant, unanswerable question. Detective Rowan walked the empty streets at dusk, retracing routes once traveled by those who had vanished, the wind carrying the faint echo of steps that no longer existed. The families returned home, their lives forever altered by knowledge that was both revelation and torment. Some felt relief that the orchestrator had been identified, that the decades of uncertainty had a source. Others felt anguish, realizing that even with truth exposed, reunion was impossible. The missing had become more than victims. They were symbols of silence, absence, and the unyielding persistence of memory. Every object found, every whisper recording, every fragment of the final tape now carried a weight far beyond evidence. It was a residue of lives interrupted. Rowan reviewed the files late into the night, the photographs and objects laid out across the desk like a map of vanished existences. The tunnels beneath the towns had been sealed, the clues preserved for posterity. But even with forensic breakthroughs and confession, there remained gaps. Names, motives, and some locations of the missing still eluded discovery. It was as if the world itself had conspired with time to hide certain truths, leaving only echoes for the living to grasp. Yet in those echoes, there was a kind of persistence. Neighbors recalled fleeting glimpses. Children remembered drawings that hinted at hidden worlds, and townsfolk spoke of sensations, fleeting and inexplicable, that something was always watching, always aware. Rowan realized that closure would be incomplete without honoring these fragments, without acknowledging the lived experience of absence, the psychic imprint left by the vanished on every corner of the towns. The investigation now shifted from pursuit to preservation. Families documented memories, photographs, and stories. Local historians recorded timelines. Every fragment, no matter how small, became part of a living archive. The community understood that the missing would never truly return, but their lives, their choices, and their disappearance would not vanish into obscurity. Even in absence, they shaped the present, influencing how the town remembered, how detectives pursued justice, and how empathy stretched across decades. In the quiet moments, Rowan often returned to the final tape, listening to the measured, calm voice that had orchestrated terror. The confession had provided answers, yet it also underscored the enormity of loss. Some questions will remain forever unanswered. Why these 5, at that precise time, in that precise way? Why had the missing been selected with such chilling randomness? The detective understood that some mysteries do not conclude neatly. They echo, lingering as warnings, reminders, and calls to memory. And so, the story of the vanished closed not with reunion, but with recognition. The 5 who disappeared without a trace remained absent, yet their presence was undeniable in the hearts of those who loved them, in the records that survived, and in the lessons whispered to a world that sometimes loses sight of those who quietly vanish. The echoes of the unfound were now permanent, a testament to lives interrupted, a shadow cast across time, and a reminder that truth, however delayed, must be pursued relentlessly. The investigation was over, but the memory of the missing would endure, eternal in its haunting clarity, resonating in every quiet corner of the towns they once called home. Thanks for watching.